Welcome guys, I am Tanner Kuhn and this is an audio podcast where we are discussing the life and future of radio broadcasting. And today's topic is, did video kill the radio star? Now this is a topic based on how has television affected the success and the relevancy of radio broadcasting as we know it today. We're going to talk about the history of not just radio, but also the history of television and how they coincide with one another, how they compete with one another. But ultimately, our focus today is on radio broadcasting. So to jump right into things, we're going to jump into the history of radio broadcasting. Now, it goes without saying that anyone listening to this podcast knows what a radio is and you know how it works. Radio has played a significant role in most everyone's lives, not just in the entertainment part of everyone's lives, but also in communication. So when was radio first invented? The inventor of the radio is actually a hot topic of debate. There are several people that will give you several different answers, but the overall agreed upon answer is Guglielmo Marconi. Others might argue it was Reginald Fessenden or William Dubier or even Nikola Tesla. Yes, that Nikola Tesla. But today we are going to focus on Marconi as he is the first person that was able to patent his, and he is widely acclaimed of creating the radio. So Marconi was the first to build his and file a patent in 1896, after which he successfully built his quote-unquote radio, which was basically a wireless telegram that transmitted Morse code from a kilometer away. So Marconi actually kind of made the world's first walkie-talkie. A few years later, though, in 1901, he would do something that no one thought possible. He would actually transmit and receive a signal across the Atlantic Ocean. He telegraphed the singular letter S from England to Canada, and he would end up receiving the Nobel Prize in Physics for his contributions, paving the way for wireless transmission of telegraphs. And he became, as I know, the first person to receive a Nobel Prize for what I consider a typo today. Now, obviously, this was not just a big deal because a wireless transmitter didn't require all of the wires and extra supplies and manpower that was needed for telegrams, as well as what you would need in terms of translators and all of that stuff. It wasn't just because it took all of that away, but because it now allowed people to communicate a lot more efficiently, and they could speak directly to people rather than having to have a translator there, translate your message into Morse code, send it one letter at a time, and then have someone on the other end receive that message and have to decipher it and then read your message. They can now just hear your voice directly saying what you want them to hear. And this was a game changer in this world. And as most great things in this world, especially great inventions, it is not considered great in America's eyes unless it can be used in war. And conveniently, around the time that the radio was getting a little more efficient, World War I was just around the corner, as this was all happening in the early 1900s. The radio would play a key role in communication, as troops and commanders both could now give very detailed instructions and communicate back to the commanders what they were seeing on the battlefield in a fraction of the time. And not only that, but they could also do it with just a fraction of the supplies. Now, this not only allowed them to just communicate better and more efficiently, but now they could communicate in real time, and platoons could now make real-time strategy changes. The troopers could communicate to the commanders what they are seeing on the battlefield, and the commanders could quickly tell them how they should counter it and where they should put their manpower. This was an absolute game changer on the battlefield. And so this quickly caught America's eyes. And after this, we would start seeing it more in advertising, and this also birthed kind of how we see modern advertising today, as it wasn't just in the newspaper and you were having to describe it. You could actually pitch your invention and what you were wanting your audience to hear from your own mouth. So this was an absolute game changer in advertising. It helped pave the way for many different forms of advertising, but it was mostly used for political propaganda in its day. It had also, though, not just being advertising, but it had now become the most indispensable way to communicate important news to a wide audience. By the 1920s, Chevy would implement the first ever car radio, and by 1936, 3/4 of American families would begin to own radios and listen to music, breaking news, sports, and even political debates from the comfort of their own home. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Now, I do need to clarify, the first car radio was mainly for the wealthy people. It was not the car radio as in you think today of you hop in, you turn on your car, and there it's just compactly sitting in your dashboard and you can turn on whatever radio station you want to turn on. This thing was absolutely massive. It had a huge antenna, a bunch of wires, it had its own battery that it had to run off of, and it was mainly for the wealthy people. And honestly, it was about the size of the car, but nonetheless, it was a functioning radio inside of a moving vehicle. So Chevy did implement the first one in the early 1920s, and it quickly grew from there. And I don't really think people realize how big this was for the middle class families at this time. Before this, any type of information you got was either word to mouth, it was letters, or it was newspapers. And now you didn't have to wait for the newspaper, you didn't have to wait for a letter from your loved one. You weren't relying on your neighbor to communicate quickly with you and to be truthful with you, but you could actually get the journalists themselves, you could get news people themselves, you could get politicians, musicians. Everyone was personally inside of your home. And without having to go buy tickets to a concert or go stand in lines and go buy record vinyls, you could get that instantly now just from going into your living room, walking to the box sitting in the corner and clicking it on. This was absolutely revolutionary for the time. So politicians now could talk directly to middle class families, and this changed everything, as now their speeches were a lot more personable and the president could speak to you personally. And for the first time in American history, it really felt like the president of the United States was talking to you while sitting in your living room. Political debates were now on a much larger scale, and they had a much larger audience that they could persuade people, and they didn't have to travel for hours to come see them, or reverse, the politician didn't have to travel several hours to a very small town to talk to a very small group of people. They could now do that instantly at a mass scale, and this changed everything for politics in America, but also just communication in general for America. It also revolutionized sporting, because now you didn't have to go buy tickets to the game or just wait for the score to come out on the newspaper, or I don't know, somehow be on the outside and have someone you know telling you the score in real time, or it would be somewhat delayed. But now you could tune in on the radio and have someone telling you not just the score and not just what's kind of happening, but you could get the at-bat walk-up. Every little detail that was happening in the game was being directly relayed to you. And this changed everything in sports. Not just sporting though, but also in music. Again, it not just saved people time and money, but now musicians had a much wider audience that they could reach. And they could reach people they never would be able to reach before, again, without having to travel several hours out of their way and go play for these people that probably wouldn't really like them. And that was kind of the risk back then. And radio would actually, because of this, it would even popularize new genres of music, the most famous one being rock and roll, with Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry and everyone in that nature. Now, shifting gears, we are now going to get into how did TV affect the popularity of radio. So to get to the bottom of this, we have to go into the history of television. But before we get into the history of television, I'm so sorry, we have to do a short little history on the camera, because there could not be television without motion picture. So the invention of the still frame camera was already invented by this time, or by the radio's invention, I'll say, as the still frame camera was invented in 1827 by a French inventor, Joseph Napes. But no one had ever captured a moving picture before. The first moving picture ever invented was by another French inventor named Louis Le Prince. In October of 1888, he filmed the world's very first movie, where he filmed the Roundhay Garden in Leeds, England. The film consists of 4 people in frame, and they're dancing in circles. It is up on YouTube. The film is 3 seconds long, and it is now referred to as the Roundhay Garden scene. If you want to go watch that, I highly recommend it. It's 3 seconds. The video itself that's posted is like 20 seconds because it plays it several times in a row. But it's a very cool scene. It's kind of eerie, to be honest, but that is the title is the Roundhay Garden scene. And I do want to reiterate, the first movie ever created was only 3 seconds long, and that is so cool to me that he was able to make it last at least 3 seconds, considering no one had even imagined capturing something moving for a second to 2 seconds. Aside from that, famously, Thomas Edison is normally credited with the first creation of the motion picture camera because he was able to patent his and commercialize his more successfully. Coincidentally, Prince was also trying to get his camera patented, but mysteriously disappeared on a train with his camera, and neither of them were ever found. So, needless to say, life kind of got in the way for Prince. But because of that, Edison was able to patent his first and commercialize his and really put mass marketing of cameras into play. Now that that's established and the history of cameras is over, let's talk about the history of television. On March 25th, 1925, John Baird, an English inventor, he invented the first true mechanical television. Now, mechanical television was a television that was run by spinning gears and spinning rings, some real Swiss Family Robinson type stuff. On September 1st, 1927, 2 years later, Philo Farnsworth, a small farmer from Utah, created the first ever electronic TV. This one would be the one people associate with the TV sets you see in the 70s, most likely your grandparents' house, or even birthing the 85-inch TLC screens everyone gets on Black Friday for $300 now. The invention of the electronic television led quickly to TV production, as the first public television broadcast ever happened on September 11th, 1929 in the British Broadcasting Company in England, better known as the BBC. Now, by 1941, we would start getting TV commercials, and they would become popular among families in the 1950s, which I believe led to the invention of the TV remote. Now, there's no evidence to support that the popularization of families finally getting the TVs in their homes led to the invention of the TV remote. But what I do know is that TVs got very popular in the 1950s, and the remote was invented on January 1st, 1956. So, was it just created to further the efficiency? Possibly, but it's also possible people were tired of hearing their neighbor complain about how they have to walk across the room to check the score of the game and decide to give people an early Christmas gift, a late Christmas gift, to say, Happy New Year, here's your remote, now go sit on the couch and watch whatever you want to watch without standing up, and please leave me alone. But I'm sorry, we're getting a little off topic, but basically what I'm trying to say is that I think January 1st, 1956 was also the invention of the couch potato. Now, a little over 10 years later, color television would become the new fad, coming into picture on November 8th, 1967, and it got very popular around the early 1970s. You would start seeing this more colorized version of stuff in bigger productions like music videos, things of that nature. Now that we have a history of both TV and radio, how has radio adapted to compete with TV? Because it is no question that once TV came on the scene, that TV kind of exploded, because now you didn't just have to sit in your home and listen and imagine what's happening. You could actually now in real time watch what's happening and see it with your own eyes while also being able to hear it. So this again revolutionized everything from news to music to political debates to sports. Anything you can think of that you probably see now, TV shows, talk shows, anything entertainment wise or broadcasting wise that you can think of, this was absolutely revolutionized once the TV hit the scene. Now, since radio had a good 20-year head start on the popularity of television, the radio had already established a firm hold on families, and it had built a very firm foundation overall in how radio worked and what got people's attention as far as entertainment purposes go. At this time before television, radio entertainment was very similar to television in that they would hold live in studio performances and they would have talk shows with guests on their shows. But once television gained popularity, most of these live in-studio performances stopped as they were very, very expensive, and radio just could not compete with the live in-studio performances of the television. Now, this did force them to resort to cheaper methods of entertainment, such as playing less expensive recordings. But not only that, once people started seeing how popular TV was becoming, all of the advertisers, well, I won't say all, but most of the advertisers immediately left radio and flocked to the television scene, as they can now show their product and how it works rather than just describing how it works over the radio with no visuals, or having to print photos and print multiple photos to show how your product works. Not only that, but they could also start branding themselves to be a lot more appealing to audiences who see them on the TV. So you'll start seeing a lot more colors, bright popping colors, things like McDonald's, anything of that nature where you're using the color to grab your audience. You really started seeing this being popularized once the television came out, because all of the advertisers were leaving and running to the television scene. This leaving of advertisers and entertainment directly affected the budget for most of these radio stations, and this led to mass layoffs. These layoffs started to happen as soon as the money was depleting from their bank accounts, and quickly. And stations quickly also found out that they only required one person to play the records, read the advertisements, and make new announcements. Thus, the disc jockey was born. So after the radio humbly created the DJ, radio would have to get serious if it wanted to be able to compete with television. This led to what is known as format radio. Managers enforced rules to give their station certain personalities, focus on consistency, how many songs and what genre of songs to play, what the station ID should sound like, and how many commercials they should have and the time they should play. This is the kind of radio that you will see, or not see, I guess, the type of radio you will hear nowadays. Of the radio station normally has a certain genre of music that they play, or talk shows are very theme oriented. Now, this also forced radios to become much more locally focused, and they got very involved in their communities. They would hold contests, they would give out tickets to local concerts, and they would even start reporting on more local news. Although this would mean they're not on the huge scale that they used to be, the shift in strategy for radio would keep radio very relevant even as the popularity of television was booming. Now, this shift also led radio to becoming much more music-centric rather than entertainment-centric, and it created that annoying cycle of the most popular songs are playing multiple times a day until it is no longer popular. But this paved the way for more impactful things we see today, such as the Billboard Top 100 charts, which was directly created by radio, because how they determined it was where it shows what the most popular / most played songs for each year, and it was invented in 1955. It involved record sales, but also jukebox and disc jockey play charts that were used to calculate which songs were deemed the most popular. Now, we are also in the age where smartphones have finally come into play, and how has smartphones affected the popularity of radio? Today, radio faces more competition than ever, and as we sit in the digital age and everything you want to listen to or watch is just one pocket reach away. Not only this, but television has also evolved, as we have seen much more streaming services come into play. So the personalizing the television experience where people can choose what they want to watch, whenever they want to watch it, for however long they want to watch it, has really made it difficult for radio to compete. Now, in an age where radio seems like it would not be needed anymore, somehow it has still been thriving. So how has radio been competing with smartphones and streaming services in the digital age? Well, it's actually been found that the introduction of smartphones has aided the success of radio broadcasting. Since people now have access to their phones at all times and whenever they want, more people can actually tune into radio stations on their phones. And along with this, some radio stations, mainly talk shows though, they have actually started uploading recordings of their shows after they go off air, and people can go back and watch them. And that is huge in radio, because not only can people go back and watch them if they really like that episode, but people that may not be able to tune in at your exact time that you're going on the air can now go back and watch what you are putting out. So that is huge for radio. And these things can be apps such as iHeartRadio or websites of the radio station themselves, or even on YouTube. Smartphones have also aided in the interactivity of radio and their listeners, because now personalities on the radio can engage much more interactively and personably with their audience, and they can also do this now in the real time, which is a huge factor, because they can now not only have to take phone calls, but they can even email, they can text, they can direct message on social media platforms. It has really changed the game in their factor of communicating to their audience. Another major factor for radio versus smartphones and television is radio is very reliable during major storms and disasters. In the event of a disaster, smartphones can be very unreliable, as they die, they get damaged from water or anything like that, or all the phone lines are jammed because everyone's trying to call their families all at the same time. And television can be difficult to access unless you're in your home and you still somehow have TV service. But aside from that, radio can withstand all of these circumstances, and broadcasters are actually able to broadcast efficiently during and after a storm, and they can communicate directly in real time to their audience what the storm is doing, what's happening, and what they should be doing to take care of themselves and their families. So how popular is radio as of today? As of today, radio is still very, very relevant and is actually used on the daily. According to Statista.com, radio reaches a weekly audience of 82% of Americans. That is an absurd amount considering how many people live in America. There are roughly 15,445 radio stations in the United States. Online radio has a total of 974 minutes played monthly, which comes out to around 4 hours a week, which isn't a ton, but considering it's a very new form of consuming radio, that is still a lot, considering that is also a nationwide average. In 2022, American radio stations generated a total of $12 billion US, and 1.7 million of that was from online radio streaming. And again, that does not sound like a lot compared to the 12 billion in total, but there's still not a ton of online radio that is happening, or is just not as popular as traditional radio. So how popular is radio compared to television? Since radio seems like it's very popular, Americans actually watch an average of 33 hours of television a week. So television is used a lot more frequently, but more people are leaving cable and satellite TV in favor of streaming services such as Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, Max, etc. And more than 70% of households now own a smart TV. So this is what I was talking about in smart TV, and streaming services have really started to take over the television industry. And you see this with a lot of people leaving cable and satellite because they can now go to a streaming platform and they can watch whatever episode of whatever show they want to watch, and they can even watch certain snippets of certain episodes. If they don't want to watch the full episode, they can jump to their favorite part of that episode and just watch that. Sports have also played a big part in TV success, because most sporting events are, I would say, an average of at least 2 hours long. So when people tune into a sporting event on the television, they are planning to be there for at least 2 hours. Most of the time, the sporting event is around 3 to 4 hours. In support of this is in 2022, there was the Eagles versus Chiefs Super Bowl, and that had 115 million Americans watching, which is 35% of the American population. This sporting event alone was the top 3 most watched watched broadcast television program in history. So as TV seems like it is still dominating the scene, what does the future of radio look like then? If TV is dominating and seems like it is continuously growing, how is radio going to continue to compete, and will radio die out? So to me, the future of radio still seems very bright, and it does look like radio broadcasting does not plan on going anywhere anytime soon, and it will actually only improve. There are talks that radio will actually soon try to integrate video technology to implement videos and graphics as well as other visual elements in their audio content. This was actually, there were radios in the early 1940s, 1950s, around when TV was starting to come out. There were radios that actually had small little circular screens, and they would show pictures. Some of them, if you were wealthier, they did have moving pictures. And so this is not the first time we have seen this with radio technically, but on the scale and the quality of video that would be being used, this would be absolutely revolutionary to radio, as now it can directly compete with television on their own playing field. This would include also live streaming events, visual accompaniments to music and talk-based programs, and other interactive elements. Guys, I think it is safe to say that radio broadcasting is not going anywhere. Although it might not match up with the popularity and long-form use of television as time goes on, radio does seem to be becoming more popular than ever. While television does have longer streaming hours, I think it is important to remember that radio is mainly for short-term use. Because when you think about it, people tune into a radio not intending on being there for a very long time. At least I do not. Unless there is a sporting event happening, which even sporting events, when you match them up, people do not tune in on the radio for as long as they tune in on the TV for a sporting event. But when people get in their car, tune in on the radio, or even tune in online on an app, most of the time they do not plan on being there, but maybe an hour at most. Most radio talk shows are around 30 minutes to an hour, so most of the time an hour is just as long as people are mentally prepared to be engaged in this radio broadcast, compared to TV, where if you get home and you want to watch one movie and then go to bed, that one movie is going to be around an hour and a half to possibly even 2.5 hours long. So that one movie that you watch is roughly the length of, it could be 2.5 radio talk shows if all of those talk shows are an hour long. So when people tune in on radio, I do think it is important to remember that they're not planning on tuning in for several hours at a time, and they're not going to get home and turn on the radio. Radio has become the more convenient form of getting your information, listening to music as you're on the go, because TV you can't watch, it's very distracting, it's not safe to do while you're driving. But radio is there, it's convenient, everyone and their grandmother knows how to use it, it's very user friendly. But not just that, I think it's also important to remember that people love radio, and they love the personality that comes with radio. Because when I tune into radio stations in my local area, it does feel a lot more personable than if I go tune in on, let's say, the local news. Because the local news, although it is local, they're having a lot of different places they're having to get news from. There might not be stuff happening in my area for them to report on. Whereas local radio, they are always getting so involved in their communities. They're always looking for the happening, what's going on, what events are coming up, what bands are playing where, and they are always promoting these types of things and trying to get their community more involved with each other. And not only that, but when you listen to a radio station, you can call into that radio station. So you're not only able to listen to what's happening, but for the most part, there's a very good chance that you can actually become a part of what you're listening to. You can call the talk show that you listen to every morning on your way to work, and you can call in one day that you have an off day, and you can actually join the show, and you can talk to them, not face to face, but as close as you can face to face over the phone. Some of them, I'm sure you probably can do Skype or Zoom or some type of live video chat, but that is another main difference I think people miss on why radio has still remained so relevant compared to television, in that television, people I feel are getting more and more more burnt out just because television has become very oversaturated, and television, it always has some type of political agenda or corporate agenda, and there's always some type of branding being thrown in your face, or some type of forced branding, or some type of opinion that's being upheld and you don't really agree with it, or you just don't really want to see it because you don't really care about it. It's not as personable because they are trying to reach and be very appealing to such a wide audience. When you really hone in on a smaller local audience, you can become so much more personal and get such better engagement because you can curate your content and everything you do more centrally focused on a certain place and on the people that are in that community. So I think that is another factor to really consider when talking about the difference between radio and television, in that yes, radio will never be able to compete, in my opinion, with television on the field of people tuning in for hours and hours on end and being psychologically tricked into staying on longer than they want to. But I will challenge them and say that I think there's a lot of things that radio can do that TV just cannot do and that TV cannot keep up with. And that is having a more personable approach, being a lot more loose and personable with your audience, letting your personality come through and talk about what's happening in your life, relate to your audience directly, and even finding out what's happening in your audience's life directly, whether it's through emails or people sending in questions, or having a spot on your show where people can call in and you talk to them directly. But that is my final thing I want people to keep in mind when thinking on the longevity of radio and how it is still stayed so relevant today, even though radio itself is over 100 years old. So guys, I think it is safe to say that video did not kill the radio star. Instead, video actually aided the radio star and has pushed audiences to radio who are tired of hearing these corporate messages and political agendas and things that are not curated to their liking. Radio, although it is again over 100 years old, it still remains so relevant today, not just to me, but to you and to everyone's listening, because everyone you know, and most likely you, listen to radio every day. If not every day, you listen to it very frequently, or you at least know what a radio is. But thank you so much for listening. This is Tanner Kuhn signing off.